Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for coming, and I'm most grateful for such a receptive and big audience. All retired professors dream about having such audience which is not captive. You are all voluntary here, so it cheers me up very much. As I'm repeating all the time the main things, these three lectures aim not so much at providing details of the constantly changing picture of a Russian invasion and Ukrainian opposition. There are some very good sources I can recommend if you ask later, but in providing you with the big picture and understanding, that is answer for question why. So first lecture was explaining the overall configuration, which suggests that we gain a good understanding by seeing this war, this invasion and opposition as a part of the long-term process of fragmentation of the Russian Empire. It attempted to fragment first time during the revolution and the Bolshevik period of power, which stretched between, not the revolution, but 1922, when Soviet Union became sort of openly a dictatorship, suppressed all the independence movements, and 1989, when it collapsed in a typical imperial overstretch. It gave way to the centrifugal forces which every empire unleashes. And two reasons for which empires are unstable and sooner or later start to experience those centrifugal fragmenting forces, these two reasons are: first, that they have to maintain unity in forcibly united entity, multi-ethnic entity, okay, which gives the center, the ruling center, enormous advantages over the periphery. The peripheries, everyone else, are ripped off. And they maintain this relation only by fair degree of force, violence, propaganda, and exercises those economic mechanisms of ripping off through terms of trade, through the division of labor, which is enforced on the periphery from the center, which are all disadvantageous to the peripheries. So this is the first. Like the Roman Empire, maintaining such cumbersome and asymmetric entity becomes more and more expensive. You need huge bureaucracies, you need cumbersome non-economic economies of central management, which the Soviets called central planning. There was no planning in it. It was central management, enforced and subordinated entities against their will. And second force is nationalistic movement, national liberation movements. The most powerful historically movements we know in modern world, okay? Which you can think about as movements of dignity, that suddenly people cease to see themselves as citizens of the empire, subject of the emperor, and increasingly identify with nations, with ethno-religious groups which are smaller and which form gradually independent states. That coincides usually with industrialization. Why? Because industrial production, unlike agricultural production of relatively independent peasants, industrial production requires coordination of people in industrial enterprises, and for that they need common understanding, education, and above all, common language. So nationalistic movements are around the issues of cultural autonomy for their own language, France for the French, for their bonds of solidarity which are derived not from common subordination to powerful emperors, but subordination of a different nature, solidarity derived from a sense of interdependence. We need each other. Only in industrial societies, the sense of interdependence allows to build bonds of strong solidarity around common culture, which is necessary to coordinate human activities in organized entities, which we call industrial enterprises. Second second lecture was about the key actors in these processes of conflict and fragmentation, which is resisted by Putin, both on the ideological, military, political, and cultural level. And I explained that these events, dramatic events of the last 20 years, because it started very early. I will explain later how the war was first modeled and how the model of Georgian subordination was seen by Putin as so effective. Putin was the first neo-imperial post-Soviet leader. Just before his death, Yeltsin was asked what was his major achievement and what was his biggest mistake. And Yeltsin said, I don't know, probably forming the Russian Federation was my biggest achievement, but my biggest mistake, I know precisely, appointing Putin as a guardian of this entity. Because Putin started to drive first towards joining the European Union, this new interesting entity, which allowed 450 million people to live in increasing prosperity, security, dignity, sense of justice, and enormous pride of being members of an entity which did not require to whip up nationalisms, but gave people a very good reason to be proud of as citizens of this new, strange, unusual entity which starts to resemble a commonwealth, voluntary association of nations. Putin went through the process of conversion when? Probably in his second term. Around 2003-04, suddenly his pronouncement changed dramatically. Why? Because of the experience of successes where he should have experienced failure. The reaction of the European Union, United States, to Putin's sudden aggressive move against the European movement, against NATO, between you and me, was, and I hope ceased to be, but was a bit of a paper tiger. West European nations relied on the American nuclear umbrella and to a lesser extent on the French. As you remember, French were in and out of it. And Great Britain had independence nuclear deterrence too, but it was very strictly coordinated with the Americans. So as long as the Americans were committed to defense of Europe, NATO could work. But it stopped, and I'll talk about it in a moment. So Putin changed dramatically, embraced the neo-imperial ideology, not Soviet Union, not rebuilding Soviet Union. When they told him that Georgians and Armenians demolish the monuments of Lenin, he said, yes, good on them. Lenin was wrong. We should return to the Russian model, imperial model, based on this Byzantine notion of Moscow being the third Rome and the fourth one cannot be. It will end history, and it's based on the common religious beliefs, Orthodox religion, but Orthodox universal among all Slavs. He could not predict that Ukraine and others start to detach themselves from the patriarchate, in which the political leader is also de facto leader of the church, and the church conduct very strong propaganda to emphasize the unity of the empire, based also on cultural unity, whereby Russian language becomes lingua franca, de facto the language of the empire. And this empire, and the vision of it, was provided to Putin by Alexander Dugin, the philosopher and politologist. He called himself sociologist. Don't believe in that. Who produced this bizarre, for us bizarre, but for Putin extremely useful vision of Euro-Asian empire, arguing that it's based on scientific analysis of political geography. And I reminded you this vision of empire from Lisbon and Dublin to Vladivostok, covering Russia and Europe based on the common faith, based on the common political structure with relative autonomy of sub-imperial entities, one center in Berlin and one center in Tehran, and that's a novelty. It also was to be an empire in which Islam, including radical Islam, was allowed to flourish. Especially, he believed that the Iranian version of Shiite religion is absolutely compatible with the empire. Do we need to take seriously those visions? Probably not. But it was extremely useful for two important constituencies. First, the military. And remember, Putin developed a very specific political structure. Elite, Putin and surrounding elite are called silaviki, which means the best translation is probably the powerful ones, military or uniformed services, because it includes also the border guards, police, KGB, FSB, should I say, and many other uniformed forces is at the center. And they really lapped it with great appetite. It was very popular as a sort of ideology and became, Putin insisted that this vision of Euro-Asian empire as the future, rejecting the Soviet model as failure, should be taught in all military academies and tertiary institutions which produce officer corps for siłowiki. And second audience were the simple Russians, who are not always interested in politics, which are dependent on the authorities to tell them what to do and what to think. It was quite popular. It was widely read, and the recent production of Dugin is an interesting book on Trump, which repeats almost verbatim what Trump says about the origin of his own regime, that Trump conducted a revolution in the United States which strengthens central power and which is brought by overcoming this mythical deep state, allegedly preventing him from grabbing power. Zełenski was the second figure. I didn't talk about him very much. But Zełenski emerged in a very unusual way. He gained power after the second revolution. There were two revolutions in Ukraine after 89-91, the period of collapse of the Soviet Union and initial autonomy movement. First in 2004, the Orange Revolution, which was unsuccessful, but revealed enormous corruption among the Ukrainian oligarchs. Enormous corruption. And revealed also very strong influence of Russia on both top politicians and top oligarchs. The second revolution in 2014, which followed the tariff war declared by Russia, attempt to draw Ukraine into the economic common market, in inverted comma, was very successful. It removed a very corrupt leader, Yanukovych, who had to escape with his lover and 2 suitcases of dollars to Moscow. And he's kept there in the freezer just in case. And it was followed by election in which Zełenski received enormous amount of vote, the most endorsed, powerfully endorsed Ukrainian leader. He got nearly 70% of popular vote. Unthinkable. Why? Because partly people confused him with the role he plays in the immensely popular sitcom, The Servant of the People, in which he played the role of a local teacher fighting against corruption of the system. He was the answer to the dreams of Ukrainians to rid themselves with this corrupt superstructure in politics, and they wanted someone who will tell the truth and start anti-corruption drive, and again also defend Ukraine against attempts by Russia to maintain this corrupt system which served Putin very well. Zelensky was fantastic in using his media image and appeal. He is very charismatic leader. You would expect from a good actor and popular comedian to be able to speak the language people understood. And he was very, very clever. He was trained as lawyer, but in the engineering institute, one of the best in Ukraine. And initially he spoke Russian, but he also knew English, German, and French. But he learned, within weeks, he learned fluent Ukrainian. And he started to push the very effective anti-corruption program in Ukraine. Amazing success, amazing success. Even the relatively less corrupt ex-president Poroshenko, who owned the huge chocolate and lolly empire in Ukraine, couldn't counter him. And everyone endorsed him. He became the popular hero in Ukraine, and he developed extremely good relations with European leaders and then American administration of Biden, Democratic administration. So we are dealing with a man who is very clever, but now is under enormous pressure for the third hero, Donald Trump. The first administration of Trump between 16 and 20 was relatively harmless, although it soiled the relationship between Zelensky and Trump, because Trump, being Donald Trump, demanded from Zelensky some dirt on Biden's son, who was involved in some oil and gas deals and mineral deals in Ukraine. He said, either you give me some compromitati, that is compromising materials on Biden's son, which allows me to launch my election campaign in America, or we won't support you. But it didn't work. Zelensky was wise enough to refuse to produce compromising material, to get involved in Donald Trump's dirty war. And under Biden enjoyed tremendous support from America in the form of high tech, okay, to which I'm coming now. But it started to, developments later started to reveal that Donald Trump has been very heavily involved in Russia. I mention it only generally, but a lot of materials start to be revealed only now, and not necessarily in English. But in my native Poland, a lot of books and articles start to appear about the beginning of Trump's involvement with Russian oligarchs and Putin. First wife of Donald Trump, whom he married in 1977, Ivanka Zelazovich. Am I mispronouncing my name? I'll check in a moment. Was a very interesting figure. She was a daughter of the Czech very high security official, Czechoslovak then. Remember, we are in 70s. Soviet Union is still in power. And the father of Ivanka, now we've got documents, was in contact with the Soviet KGB, as all Czechoslovak services were at that time. He was one of the leading confidants, link between Czechoslovak and then Soviet KGB Secret Service forces, and got KGB interested in Putin as a, first of all, the partner in business deals. And these business deals blossomed. Did Ivanka know about it? We don't know, we have no documents, but it would be unusual that Putin, Donald Trump started to get invitations to Moscow, started building his business empire in Moscow from that time. It reached the peak in the 80s. In 86 and 7, he was invited by the then ambassador of the Soviet Union in Washington to Moscow, all expenses paid, with his entourage, with his wife and first son, and they were offered fantastic deals in Moscow. It was a campaign of trying to get into American top business. And he was the black horse in which the KGB probably invested a lot of money, as later it was revealed by Donald Trump Jr., his son with Ivanka, who said that my dad many times was saved from fall by the Russian money. The rest you probably read everywhere. There were very strong interference, pro-Putin, pro-Donald Trump interferences in American politics, which you heard of, so I won't repeat it. So this is when we finished, that now we are in the situation when control over the armistice and peace process is out of the hand of Zelensky. Americans, or Donald Trump and his team, and Putin start to negotiate, and they don't negotiate necessarily in the best interest of Ukraine. We are in a terrible situation where Donald Trump applies the same failed model which he, in the first term of office, applied in North Korea. Putin loves to be glorified, loves to embrace dictators, even if he gets nothing in return. As you remember, he agreed to go to North Korea, hugged the Kim and his top dictators, proposed to them nuclear disarmament deal, which they agreed initially, but preparing transfer of the nuclear weapons, not to destroy those weapons, but transfer them over the border to China, to keep them there in mothballs for better times. But nothing came out of it. Donald Trump did not even achieve any conditions of supervision of this deal. It was awful, terrible, and it's good that it ended with nothing. But it revealed his limited capacity to what he called cut deals. It was rather an aggrandizement of his own person. And his love of dictators. He loved strong-hand dictators, despots, tyrants, as Americans would call them. So it looks like the peace deal will be long and will end with similar failure. And we'll have, at best, the frozen conflict in Ukraine, because Putin is encouraged not to give up, and Americans want to insist on three things which need to be saved. Three things Ukraine needs to maintain its position outside the empire. Political autonomy, that they won't be able to decide who governs them. And now it looks like Donald Trump would be very happy if Zelensky resigned. Without Zelensky, it's very difficult to find equally charismatic, supported, trusted, and clever leader. Secondly, Putin will insist on disarming Ukraine. Under Zelensky leadership, they managed to gather a very powerful army, not powerful in the sense of numbers, but so flexibly organized that they can absorb new technologies, especially drone warfare and cyber warfare, so quickly that they beat the Russians in the first stage of the war. Immensely powerful, capable military force. And thirdly, he should be able to defend not territory. Territory he is bound to lose. But Ukraine is 600,000 square kilometers, okay? Even when 20% of it, as it's looking now, might be maintained under Russian occupation, it won't diminish the enormous potential Ukraine has as a source of very clever labor force, very clever, the most fertile lands and very powerful agriculture, and the very powerful human capital they had. Remember, it's Ukraine which became the industrial center of development, not Russia before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So these three things he has to maintain, and we don't know whether he will maintain it. And now it brings us to the last point, the conduct of the war. Putin thought that it will be a short and sweet operation. The tanks will roll. His claim that Kiev is the cradle of the Russian civilization would be enforced. It's not. And that he will be allowed to reintroduce his candidate like Yanukovych, who will follow by integrating Ukraine economically with this strange agreement, tariff agreement, which is called Eurasec, Euro-Asian Trade and Security Zone, something like that. It didn't work. Number of miscalculations. First miscalculation was that Ukraine can be economically pressed into it. Hence the chocolate wars, the tariff wars in 2013. Ukraine said, okay, you might impose tariffs on us, we won't ban, we'll sell to Europe. And Europe said, yeah, we can take a chunk of the Ukrainian production, even in the areas which threatens Polish and French farmers, etc., etc. Second, he thought that Ukraine will bend under pressure of forcing Yanukovych to change, to abandon the trade deal with European Union. They didn't. They kicked Yanukovych out of Kiev in 14. Third, by separatist movements, encouraging separatist movements. Sending soldiers, so-called, they call them little green men, because they denied that they are Russian soldiers. They all wore very similar uniforms and surprisingly had weapons which they brought over the border. They declared independent entities in eastern Ukraine and conducted the so-called referendum, which resulted in detachment and then annexation of Crimea. Annexation of Crimea was a strange one. It was falsified. We know the results of the referendum, and Putin didn't get majority, but Ukrainians also didn't get majority. Most of Crimeans thought, well, we'll be better off being independent. But he falsified the results and took over in 2014 Crimea. And then when the invasion started, the People's Republics in eastern Ukraine, Donbas People Republic, Luzhansk People Republic, declared that they want to join the motherland and they want to be incorporated in Russia, which Putin agreed to. So it was obviously a well-tried model. Where did Putin develop this model? It was very effective in dealing with previous attempt in 2008 of Georgia, in Georgia, separation of Georgia. Georgians declared themselves under the leadership of very reformist but slightly crazy leaders, Mikhail Saakashvili, to cut themselves from Russia, from Russian tutelage, and Russian did what they developed as a model of imperial reattachment. First, they organized separatist movement in Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, which took a big chunk of land by what? Bribing the local ethno-industrial leaders and promising them support and security. Georgians, it's a small nation, only 3 million people. They couldn't resist. But after declaring independence of Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, they sent troops and organized a bloodbath for Georgians. Bloodbath. In 2008, in such a small nation, it was enough to kill about 30,000 people to browbeat them into submission. It was extremely brutal. So Georgian fell into line, and Putin promised them Georgian Dream, that was the name of the pro-Russian party, and used his political leadership, but above all, oligarch Ivanishvili, the most wealthy Georgian, and organized a deal whereby Georgians would get a protection, but smuggle through one of the few operating entry to Russia, especially the high-tech equipment, including second-hand cars. We happened to be, my wife and I, in Georgia and went to this Caucasian gate to look lorry after lorry with the old, used second-hand German old cars full of chips, which they used for military production and other production. So, in the interest was to keep Georgia as its protectorate. This is the status of Georgia now. It's protectorate. It announces itself as an independent state, but its autonomy is seriously limited. The last person who was interested in, last two persons which were interested in maintaining Georgia independent was the French-born president of Georgia, but they managed to depict her as French spy. Although very popular, he was maneuvered out of power. And Saakashvili, who, under the wave of enthusiasm, decided to return to Georgia. But they arrested him, tortured him, and imprisoned him. And the last month, they added extra 8 years to his prison term. So he is out. Would this model work in Ukraine? Putin was convinced by his army generals, easy peasy. Column of tanks will enter Kiev, will bring back from the freezer Yanukovych, and everything will be fine. But it didn't happen that way. Why? And now we are at the center of very third argument, central argument for this lecture. Ukrainians mobilized and produced a formidable military defense, albeit with heavy weapon provided by the Americans and to much lesser extent the European Union, which in particular new weapons. Three types of warfare which they developed very quickly and tried proved immensely useful against overwhelming force. Remember, Russia with over 2 million army, okay, standing army, with the largest amount probably of tanks in the world, not only nuclear weapons, but also formidable new weaponry, missiles and others, suddenly was defeated. First 2 months of war was a dramatic defeat. The column and of tanks and military equipment entering from the north was stopped, and Ukrainians got fantastic anti-tank weaponry from Poland, Great Britain, and France. Fantastic, new ones, which have intelligent rockets which attack tanks not from the front or the back, where they have very powerful, strong protection, but from the top. They were going up and from the top hitting. They tried to build a sort of iron caps at the tanks to prevent it. Didn't work. So they lost about 800 tanks almost immediately. And it was inglorious defeat which forced them into withdrawing them. Second, Ukrainians adopted drone technology very quickly. And drone technology is not just using small drones, which are difficult to detect and difficult to counteract, especially if large number of cheap drones attack. And they proved immensely effective in combination with electronic surveillance. Poland paid Mr. Musk, Elon Musk, $50 million to get the rights of using his Starlink system of hundreds of satellites on low orbits, providing just-in-time view of the battlefield and extending it to Ukraine. So it's not Musk who paid for it. It was paid in the name of Ukraine by Poland, but provided Ukrainians with wonderful surveillance technology. They could see in time what was going on, and what is even more remarkable, they developed their own production of drones using models which partly Australia provided. Australia introduced in Ukraine a carton-made drone, very cheap, cost of $200-300, using the same cardboard which they used in packaging, but covered with plastic. They are difficult to detect, very cheap to produce, but they started to develop the whole range of drones, from big ones of the size of small plane, like the Iranian Shahid drones, which Russians started to importing from Iran, to small ones, which on the field provided them with enormous advantage. They use it and started to, and at present they are the biggest probably producers of drones in the world. I had two figures, 1.3 million last year, but it will be increasing to 4 million a year. Drones can be shot down if they go at the low level, and if you manage to detect them and shoot them down. But if you put a swarm of drones, they are very difficult to counteract. I was reading in The Economist that only 2 types of weapons are regarded as effective now after the war in Ukraine. Swarms of cheap drones, no counter weapon, okay? And secondly, deep diving submarines. Ukrainians developed also their own model of sea drone. Very effective, small, difficult to detect, underwater, which they send, and they managed to sink the pride of the Russian Black Sea trip, Moscow, the cruiser Moscow. And they still, Russians don't dare to put big ship, including the Black Sea is not very deep, but allowed some submarines. But Turks also try to detect the movements of the Russian fleet. So they managed to prevent Russian from the seaborne invasion from the south. And the third weapon, which proved so effective, was the long-range artillery. Long-range missiles can be detected and shot down, even if they are intelligent ones, except perhaps for some forms of cruise missiles which go very low, below radar. Okay? But they are immensely expensive. Okay? The long-range artillery produce intelligent sort of missile-type weapon which can be used up to 300 kilometers with enormous precision, because the ammunition belongs to the so-called smart ammunition. It has cameras and allowed to modify the trajectory and hit with high precision. Ukrainians got only the range of 70 kilometers, and Americans put as a condition of use of the smart artillery only on condition that they are not used in attacking the Russian territory. So Ukrainians were fighting war, but with their hands tied up. They developed fantastic training for drone operators. You have seen probably the Four Corners program or Foreign Correspondent. One of those programs was about how they operate drones in the battlefield, and it proves very deadly, very effective. The Russians started learning about it too. Don't think that they were sitting ducks. Not at all. They started to modify the strategy and the tactic and the weaponry, mostly buying drones from Iran, buying missiles from North Korea, and probably a lot of technology the Ukrainians find in the missiles they shot down from China. So they are fighting not a Ukrainian war, it's a global war. When the Russians say, yeah, Ukrainians are supported with weaponry from EU and America, Russians are supported by technology and weapons from Iran, from North Korea, and increasingly they use what Russians call nayomniki. It's a name for foreign fighters who are paid equivalent of $2,500 a month, which is enormous sum in Russia, and sent to the front. And they recruit them not only from North Korea. We hear about North Korean soldiers, probably about only 10,000 to 15,000 of North Korean soldiers, but also from Asia, from Africa, and produce this huge number of units which are populated not by conscript. In fact, the author of the best book about a Russian-Ukrainian war, called Overreach, his name just escaped me, Mitchell? Asking my wife. Okay. He claims that not a single Russian conscript died in the war. All of them are people who are paid. Prisoners who are relieved from prison. When he ran out of prisoners, he started employing minorities who are volunteer paid by Putin. From the reserves he managed to gather in the early years of his rule, about $600 billion, but he ran out of it now. So the Russians do not protest. You don't see the typical picture of the Russian widows and mothers grieving on cemeteries, okay, their dead sons, husbands, because very few ethnic Russians die in this war. You remember the story of the so-called Wagner units, okay, run by Prigozhin, which started in Africa as an intervention force in Syria, in Mali, in all places where Russians were trying to gain hold of precious rare earths, minerals, which are necessary for modern production of weapons, and transferred to Russia until they rebelled against Putin and started marching on Moscow. Then very quickly they were dissolved, taken to Belarus, dissolved, and put under the military command. And Prigozhin, like all people who oppose Putin, died in the mysterious catastrophe of the plane. But remember, Putin is using to diffuse public unease about war, and it's estimated that probably between 300,000 and 400,000 at least Russians were killed or maimed during the war. He's using mostly minorities, and of course there are grieving mothers in the republics from which in Nepal, in India, in all countries by Uzbekistan are sending Nayomniki, the fighters there. So last sentence. So what will be the outcome of all of it? We don't know, but it doesn't look like peace will be achieved by Putin-Trump negotiations. I suspect that there might be a break point where Trump will realize that giving everything to Putin doesn't work. There is, Zelensky would say, thank you very much for your attempt to bring peace, but we don't want you to run this racket anymore. And even if they achieve some form of armistice, this armistice is not going to be stable, will freeze conflict. It will be like the Middle East, like Palestine. And until Europe gathers more resources to replace America in helping Zelensky to build military force, it will be a region of unstable relations. That's the best probably predictions we can risk at present. And I don't want to leave you with the pessimistic view. So in this last part, think about how successful was Putin in achieving its goals. And its goals were to strip Ukraine from its sovereignty, disarm it, and subject it to Russian economic zone. He failed in all three. And it's enough that he maintains his autonomy, does not allow to disarm the formidable army. Ukraine has now an army which is bigger than all armies of European Union put together, and very highly skilled in modern technologies, and that he does not allow the cost of rebuilding of Ukraine, which are enormous, to be put on the European Union. Europeans are not in a position to spare in addition to arming themselves. Therefore, brilliant idea of using interests of the frozen assets of Russia in European Union, which is fully legal. They cannot use the frozen assets, but they could use interest perfectly legally to provide few $1 billion for reconstruction, helping the European Union to bear this burden of reconstruction. So did Ukraine lose this war? Not at all. It will lose territory. It will lose 300,000 men who were killed and maimed, but it is likely to maintain the most precious thing, its own independence, to join the European Union. They don't need to join NATO. They don't need to join NATO. It's enough that Ukraine, emerging from it, will cut the similar deal to what Zelensky cut with Mr. Starmer. It's a mutual security support deal between UK and Ukraine. Let's imagine that it established a similar deal with Poland, Nordic countries, possibly Romania, France, etc. And that will be enough, probably better than NATO, until NATO transforms into the European force. That's very far ahead, but Mrs. van der Leyen just established $800 billion fund from rearming European Union. With this optimistic note, thank you very much.
We were so delighted that Jan could give up 3 hours of his busy time to come and refresh us on the Ukraine.
With great pleasure.
Such knowledge, such wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh my God! Your donations from last year were passed to Ukraine.
Thank
Okay.